Hi, folks. This is the psychology of human sexuality, and we're going to be talking today about female sexual anatomy and physiology. And this is a crash course. This is not a greatly detailed description of physiology. I just want us to get the basic nomenclature down so that as we move through the course, when you hear clinical words being used, that you'll have a sense of what they mean, and you can better appreciate the material. So the first thing to note is that you will do best if you watch the PowerPoint as you listen to this. So have some other device handy to look at the PowerPoint as I talk about the subjects. So the first slide, really, the second page of the PowerPoint, is about noting that humans, male and female, are more similar than they are different. In fact, near the end of this particular subject, we'll talk about the homology between structures and functions, okay, between males and females. But basically, note that we are all conceived female, and then according to genetics, then we are driven to remain female or driven to receive testosterone, and much of that is about developing the anatomical structures of males. But that's one of the reasons that males have nipples, that those structures are in place before the male agenda hits following conception. Okay, so think for a moment about what are female sex organs all about? What are they for? Not much different than what male sex organs are for, with one difference. Um, First of all, for procreation, both males and female sex organs. Recreation, so for but three species perhaps, including humans, there is recreational sex. With all others, there is not. It's only procreative sex, and the procreative sex is part of why you see estrous cycles, and that's when you see sexual activity among other animals. But you don't see recreational sexual activity except in, for example, bonobo monkeys, our closest relative. Some say dolphins, but there's a bit debatable. Then bringing pleasure to oneself and others, absolutely. And attractiveness of one to another, sure. And the difference would be that in male sexual anatomy and organs, that the penis is for both the transmission of seminal fluid but also urine, so waste excretion. Okay? So we're going to talk about four structures in the outer vulva of the female, and that's the mons pubis, also known as the mons veneris, clitoris, labia majora, and labia minora. Okay? So you have a diagram there that gives you the position of these various structures, and they're named. So please realize that the opening from the upper reaches of the labia minora down to the lowest reaches of the labia minora, essentially the bottom of the entrance to the vagina, is called the vestibule. And the entrance to the vagina is called the introitus, okay? The introitus. The clitoris, you'll see, is at the top where the labia minora coalesce and form what we call the clitoral hood, or more properly, the prepuce, okay? You'll see that right there. And the labia minora are the inner lips or minor lips, hence the phrase labia minora, and then the outer labia majora are those that you see in the diagram that encompass the entire vulva. And that word vulva is sometimes synonymous with the word pudendum, okay? So what is first of all, the mons pubis or the mons veneris? Glad you asked, I'll tell you. So it first of all starts with hair on top of, pubic hair on top of a adipose tissue or fat, and then there is a bone beneath that, the pubic bone, which is a very strong bone which protects the female and the internal organs from damage from one origin or another. Size varies of the mons pubis. depending upon how much genetics provides for an amount greater or lesser of estrogen. It also has to do with general body fat. So the more body fat one has, the thicker the layer of the adipose tissue beneath the layer of skin there. After puberty, of course, pubic hair develops, and that pubic region evolves to become larger. That is to say, the mons veneris, and that structure becomes larger. In females who are extremely thin, you see how far this protrudes if they lay it on their back. But most of the time, you don't realize how pronounced that bone is, that structure is. Okay. Of course, this area is sensitive to stimulation, and we believe that the sweat glands of the associated with the hair follicles are places where pheromones are emitted as well. Okay. So let's talk now about the clitoris. In humans and placental mammals, the clitoris is available for excitation. It's debatable about which animals actually receive significant sexual excitement from their clitoris being rubbed in some way, because some animals don't appear to have direct contact with that structure during sex. In fact, in humans, that region is not, in general, directly stimulated during sex, with a bit of difference depending on positions that people engage in. So the clitoris is not just the glans clitoris. This is the part that actually protrudes during actual sexual excitation, but it's much more than that. It contains two structures on each side that are called the crura. One are called as a crus, two crura, and these are the blood-filled cavities all the way up into the clitoris, glans clitoris at the end, composed of corpus cavernosa. It's the same erectile tissue that composes the left and right sides of the penis. So the clitoris has more sensory nerves and therefore is more sensitive to touch than anywhere else on either male or female bodies. Densely packed, so densely packed that some females cannot tolerate direct touch there. What can we say that's most important to know? Well, it's analogous to the penis. So with early development, the male, which under the right genetics would have remained female, begins to have that tissue, which would have been the clitoris, develop into a penis. In fact, if you give females enough testosterone, in many of them, the clitoris actually grows and begins to look like a penis. It's very interesting. Okay, and the next diagram shows you this internal structure. So actually, the internal structure consists of those two sides, which really were not known until the 90s. How about that? Amazing, we didn't know that. And that corpus cavernosa, that tissue that engorges with blood and causes erection ultimately of the clitoris, which then makes it protrude, are about 3.5 inches long on each side. Yep. Now, during excitation, up until just before orgasm, the clitoris is protruding, but then it retracts beneath the prepuce, the clitoral hood, and can't be directly stimulated. And then following some patterns, follows the same patterns with repeated orgasms, but the swelling in each case is less of the clitoris. Now, I have a section here that doesn't fit really anywhere else, and it has to do with female genital mutilation. And sometimes called FSM, female sexual mutilation, or FGM, depends on who you're talking to. But these are ancient, barbaric practices of partially or wholly removing parts of the female pudendum, and it is still done today, more in countries in Africa than anywhere else, but in parts of other regions of the world too. But this is so barbaric. It is rooted in religious practices, but even beneath that, it's, in most people's opinion, rooted in male domination. Because one of the reasons that they remove at least the clitoris, if not also the labia minora, and maybe even in one form of this, suture close the labia so that no one else can have sex with that female, except a husband, should he wish to undo the suturing. It's really about the control of females. It's really about protecting virginity, or thought to. And removing the clitoris is really thought to remove a female's interest in straying from the marriage or cheating. And I have some news for people as a therapist, that women don't cheat for that reason primarily, to have wild sexual experiences. That's generally not what females will tell you that they strayed to do. About 28 countries engage in FSM, and some countries in Africa have rates as high as 98, 97% of the females have undergone FGM to one degree or another. Egypt is a little bit more than 90. It's about 96%, I think, in the last data that I saw. This is barbaric. This is absolute. The word that keeps coming to my mind is barbaric. It's senseless. It risks hemorrhaging. It risks infection. It risks all kinds of things, and doesn't do what it is supposed to do. You see. Okay. So let's talk about something more pleasant. Let's go to the labia majora. Okay. So labia majora are meaning major lips, large, prominent longitudinal cutaneous or skin folds that extend downward and backward from the mons pubis to the perineum, the area just above the anus. Shape among females is highly variable, and it does have these both sides, top and bottom, both have sufficient nerve endings that they can be very sensitive to touch. So when a female is sexually excited, there is a mild change in swelling and in color. Not dramatic, not like the labia minora, which have to do with two flaps of skin on either side of the vaginal opening and situated between the labia majora. Okay? They coalesce, as I said before, at the anterior junction to create the prepus and thus covering the clitoris. Now, shape and color and size vary significantly from female to female, and there may even be asymmetry from one side to the other in one female. They may extend outwardly. Every female is different. They are significantly sensitive to touch, and they undergo a significant swelling and change in color. They may become even purple during sexual arousal. And of course, they enclose the vestibule, which is the area between the labia. So let's talk about the internal structures, okay? Let's first talk about the vagina. The vagina can be described as a fibromuscular tube. It's a tubular tract, and that tubular tract is leads from the uterus to the exterior of the body in female placental mammals. Okay? And it encompasses the penis during coitus. It also serves as the birth canal, and it is covered with a mucous membrane. It is self-cleaning. It has a slightly acidic pH, and all of that is to protect the female. from unwanted foreign wee beasties like bacteria and viruses. And so the acidic environment and the constant downward cleaning by the mucosal membrane on the walls of the vagina perform that function. The introitus is the lower third or outermost of the vagina. If you broke it up into three places, the outer third would be called the introitus. This is where most of the vaginal nerve endings occur. In fact, beyond that, there's very little in the way of sensory nerves, and so this leads us to the observation that penis size is really not critical for reasons of pleasure, not physical pleasure. Maybe through sight, but not for what one feels. Okay, physically. You may have heard what a hymen is. A hymen is nothing more than a membrane that surrounds or partially covers, although sometimes is absent and sometimes is completely blocking the external vaginal opening. It's just barely on the inside. It's within the introitus. Variety of shapes and elasticity. Can be quite thick. In fact, so thick it may require an outpatient surgical removal of that, or at least a cutting away a portion of it. This is what creates, if there is any bleeding at first intercourse or insertion of an object or anything really, that may occur. This is the tearing of that tissue. Okay. It is thought incorrectly by some countries and groups that if you didn't bleed when you were having first intercourse, that you weren't, or what they thought was going to be first intercourse, was a sign that you weren't a virgin. And that's just not true because, again, you may not have a hymen. And you may have had that hymen tear otherwise, doing other things, either self-pleasuring or having some reason to insert some object or medication intravaginally. So in some of those places, the well-known but rarely talked about method to ostensibly show that you're a virgin is to bring chicken blood or other blood into the bed with you so that you can spread it around a little bit to make it look like you were a virgin if you really weren't or you suspect you're not. It's a safety mechanism because for thousands of years, in some places it was considered a crime to not be a virgin when you were married, punishable by death. Yeah. So we have names of various kinds of hymens, and I have a slide there showing you an annular, a dendritic, posterior, anterior lunar, those being, they look like partial phases of the moon, septate, which is a very common form, and all sorts of names that we give them in medicine. Some facts about vaginas you may not know. The average length is 3 to 6 inches. Largest in a blue whale, that's 6 to 8 feet. Thought you might be interested. Smallest is about 2 to 3 centimeters. That's about 2.54 centimeters is an inch. So that's, about an inch. And that's probably more related to a genetic issue. Vaginas expand and contract to accommodate almost any penis. And so that's another reason to not have people be fixated on penile size. So let's talk about some internal structures now. And the first one is the uterus. The uterus is a hollow, thick-walled, very muscular organ. And remember, it has to be very muscular because the contractions for both orgasm, which brings about pleasure, and for expelling a fetus is necessary. Okay, so when a female is ready to, or near ready to release an egg to be pulled into the fallopian tube in the hopes of meeting sperm to be fertilized and then have that fertilized egg, which becomes a blastocyst, and then attached to the wall of the uterus. The uterus is already preparing itself with thickening and increasing blood flow. If there is no fertilized egg that descends, in other words, an egg was not fertilized, then the egg is expelled, okay? It's just expelled through natural cleansing of the vagina as it descends through the uterus and down into the vagina. And the walls of the uterus are sloughed off, and the whole cycle repeats itself. And that sloughing of the endometrial layer is what we call a period, because some of that has blood in it. See? Okay. So that's what menstruation is, basically. All right. In women who have never had children, the uterus is approximately 3 by 3 inches. I'm changing my chair a little bit here. Thank you. I'm on a rolly chair, and it keeps moving, and I keep sliding down on the chair. The cervix is the tapered end of the uterus, and it empties into the vagina, okay? All right. Ovaries are the gonads in females that produce gametes, and in females, those gametes are eggs. In males, the gonads, the testes, produce gametes, which are sperm. So females produce eggs. Eggs are called ova. One egg is called an ovum. And they are produced and released by 2 ovaries, which are roughly the size and shape of large almonds. So they are about this big. Okay? Let's talk for a minute about eggs. So at birth, females have about 1 million eggs on board in the ovaries. But the vast majority of those are not ones that make it. They die until they're depleted at menopause, around 50, 51, something like that on average. So females during their reproductive life release approximately 300 to 400 or so on eggs, usually 1, sometimes 2, which could result in a fraternal twin birth. And the size of eggs are about the size of periods in your textbook. So you don't actually need a microscope to see one. To examine one, of course, you need a microscope. Sperm, of course, are much smaller than that. You need a microscope to see them. Okay? All right, talk about the uterine tubes, sometimes known as the fallopian tubes. And these extend outward from, but not touching the ovary. There are swaying fimbriae at the end of the fallopian tubes, which combined with the internal cilia of the very fine, no more than a human hair in diameter fallopian tubes, create a suction that pulls the egg in once released from the ovary. And it moves along that ciliated canal of the fallopian tubes all the way leading to the uterus, with or without fertilization. So if implantation of a fertilized egg sticks in the fallopian tube or migrates out of, for one reason or another, it may have been fertilized before it entered through the fimbriae into the uterine tube, it may actually lodge somewhere else. Wherever it is, other than going into the uterus, we call it an ectopic pregnancy. And just so you know, I feel like I should say this because of recent history that displays that some people don't know this, at least at the national level, that if a woman has an ectopic pregnancy, it cannot be reimplanted. It cannot be surgically removed from where it's starting to grow and implanted artificially into the wall of the uterus. That can't happen. And furthermore, if that ectopic pregnancy isn't removed surgically, it can cause hemorrhaging and death of the female. And for a time, it will develop wherever it is. So it has to be removed, and never in any way, shape, or form will that ectopic pregnancy ever be develop into a viable human. It'll never happen. So let's talk about the other internal structures. Let's talk about and external structures. Just a couple of words that you know. One is the perineum. This is the area between the genitals and the anus within the female, and in males, the perineum is the area between the anus and the lowermost portion of the scrotum. And then the anus is just the opening to the open into the outside world through the rectum, colon and rectum, and that's where feces pass. I have a little note about anus stimulation and penetration, and what I talk about with clients and with groups that I'm teaching sex education to. I say the following: always be careful. You must wash before and after. You must use a condom. You must be gentle, and you must know that this is a one-way tube, and so this is not designed for vigorous activity. It's not designed for that. Okay. I talk a little bit about breasts. Just know that these are structures which are composed of adipose or fat tissue, and there is a central nipple and an areola around that of various size. Nipples various size and diameter, various kinds of color, from pink to dark brown, I guess. And so this internally then, from the nipple inward to the breast, there are 15 to 25 lobes that radiate around the central nipple. Okay, and what we need to know is that the amount of milk that's produced in any breast is around 400 or 450 milliliters per 24 hours. That's a lot of milk. Some produce more, some produce less. Size of breast is not connected to milk production. A little bit about nipples. Nipples respond to two things by getting larger. One is cold weather, and the other is response to sexual excitation. Some females enjoy excitation of their breasts and nipples. Others find their nipples or their breasts even too sensitive to touch, and some of that may be related to the position in their menstrual cycle. Size and shape of breasts vary widely between females, and there may even be asymmetry of the size of the female breasts on one side or the other. Okay, so I think you should know one last fact, and that is that heart disease claims about 6 times as many female lives as does breast cancer, though you may not believe that because the funding for breast cancer research is pointed very directly at females getting mammograms yearly, and so the emphasis on that has created the illusion that breast cancer may be more common, but it's definitely not. There are other issues involved with that difference in advertising of healthcare for those things. So an interesting thing about the menstrual cycle and interest in sexual activity is the following. Sexual interest is not consistent with position of the menstrual cycle. So in some females, being in a period of high fertility may be a time when they feel greater interest in sexual activity, but maybe not. And for some females, they have more of an interest when they're not capable of becoming pregnant. And there are psychological elements to this, aren't there? So you can think about what those are, right? For example, women may feel more interest in sexuality when they know they can't get pregnant, when there's very little chance of that. And you can see how that could go. Okay. The last thing to tell you about female sexual anatomy and physiology is to look at the very last slide, which talks about the homologous nature of the origin of structures. So we can follow cell by cell package from conception all the way to birth in developing humans, and we can see what becomes what. What tissues in males really originated in female tissues, and how this really can tell us something about the similarities between males and females. If you know the embryology of this, if you understand the tissues and how they shift in size and shape, and in some cases position, you can feel sure that males and females are far more alike than different. So that's female anatomy and physiology. And next we're going to talk about males.